Hello, and welcome to Integrating Energy Solutions to a Greener Future, presented by the American Nuclear Society and the Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy. This evening's event is a part of our Educator Training program specifically developed for elementary through high school teachers. I am Eric Loewen, Chief Engineer and Manager of the Chief Engineer's Office at GE Hitachi Nuclear Energy, and past ANS president during the years of 2011-2012. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this webinar featuring ANS member Shannon Bragg-Sitton of Idaho National Laboratory. Before I introduce Shannon, I'd like to cover a couple of quick notes regarding today's event. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A function. We'll attempt to address as many questions as possible. The event will be recorded and a link to the meeting will be emailed to you to the event registrants either later today or definitely by tomorrow. Additionally, certificates of attendance for today's event are available upon request. Please see the chat for the contact information. And finally, we ask that all participants adhere to the ANS Code of Ethics and Responsible Behavior Policy, which can be found at our website at ans.org. So with those notes out of the way, I'd like to introduce our special guest. Dr. Shannon Bragg-Sitton is an internationally recognized pioneer in the innovative application of nuclear energy alongside other clean energy generators, seeking to maximize energy utilization, generator profitability, and grid reliability and resilience through systems integration. Shannon is the director of the Integrated Energy and Storage Systems Division in the Energy and Environment Sciences and Technology Directorate of the Idaho National Laboratory, which includes power and energy systems, energy storage and electric transportation, and hydrogen and electrochemistry departments. She also serves as the National Technical Director for the Department of Energy's Energy Integrations Systems, and which has developed novel modeling and simulation tools for the technical and economic assessment of multi-input, multi-output energy or integrated energy systems and supporting experimental capabilities. Shannon also is the chair of a recently established Generation International Forum, that's an international body, interim task force on non-electric applications of nuclear energy. With that, welcome to the seminar, and Shannon, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that introduction and for the opportunity to join this event and talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and that is clean energy systems. I am a nuclear engineer by training, have a PhD in nuclear engineering and have worked in nuclear for many years, but in the last decade have done a lot more work to cross over into clean energy technologies in general. So I'd like to share a little bit today about how those can work together, how we can use those to meet many of our energy demands. So really what I'm going to talk about today is the role of various energy sources in these integrated energy solutions that will be necessary as we seek to achieve what we refer to as a net zero economy. So what do I mean by that? First of all, net zero is referring to establishing a target where we have no greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. So that means reducing emissions, such as carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from our energy sources and other activities that we have each and every day, but then also requiring that we actually even remove some of those emissions from our atmosphere that are already there. So what are our goals really, and what do those mean? So President Biden has set a goal of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That means eliminating all emissions from our electricity sector by 2035, so it's only 12 years from now, and then achieving net zero economy-wide by 2050, meaning removing all emissions associated with electricity, transportation, and industry, all while we're also trying to invest and grow in our infrastructure, create jobs and fuel economic recovery, maintaining domestic supply chains, as well as achieving environmental justice. So these are some really big challenges that have been put forth, and we have to get creative about the solutions that we will implement in order to achieve these goals. So where are we today? If I look at today's US electricity mix, this is actually 2021 data, so recent data, we can see that still more than half of our electricity in the United States is being provided by fossil fuel resources that produce emissions when we operate those. Less than half of the electricity that we use, only about 40%, comes from clean energy sources such as nuclear, wind, hydro, solar, and biomass. If we look at that mix of clean energy, or clean electricity rather, we do see that right now about 50% of it is coming from nuclear energy. And we can see that wind has grown significantly in recent years to about 25%, solar is at about 7% and growing, and hydro is at about 17%. But there's still a lot that needs to be done to understand how we replace all of those emitting sources with clean energy. So where do we stand globally? So how big of a challenge is this if we look across the entire world? Well, electricity, we can see that the numbers reflect fairly well when we look at the global electricity generation and use from what we saw here for the US, where fossil fuels are providing about 63% of that electricity, and the remainder coming from low carbon sources. But if we look at that bigger picture and try to understand where we are from a total energy perspective, we can begin to understand the real challenge that we have in front of us, where we can see that 84% of those energy demands, which includes transportation and heat to industry, heat to homes and businesses, 84% is coming from emitting fossil fuel resources, and less than 16% from those low carbon sources. So we have a lot of work to do to replace those emitting sources. Now, there may be opportunity to capture the CO2 that's emitted by those fossil resources when we combust coal or combust natural gas, but there's a lot of progress that needs to be made in capture technologies as well. So what are the options ahead of us as we look to these novel solutions? Well, I want to frame this a little bit more as well in what the US Department of Energy is doing to try to incentivize these clean energy solutions. So in 2021, the Department of Energy established what they call their Energy Earthshots initiatives. And I like to think about this as really doubling down on the commitment to clean energy in the United States. These Earthshots put significant funding into research and development efforts that will accelerate the breakthroughs that we need to achieve abundant, affordable, and reliable clean energy solutions, and we'll do this within the decade. This is mirroring President Kennedy's moonshot speech that was in 1961, where he said, we are going to get to the moon by the end of the decade. Well, now the Department of Energy is saying we are going to create the real solutions that will address the climate crisis and help us to achieve our net zero goals by the end of this decade. So that includes work around hydrogen production. We'll talk more about what that means and why hydrogen is such an important component of our energy solutions. It also looks to long duration energy storage, so the type of storage that will help us get through seasons, not just a few hours. Also carbon negative, meaning how do we pull out some of that carbon dioxide that's already in our environment? Enhanced geothermal, meaning how can we better utilize the energy that's in the ground? I live in a very volcanic region, not too far from Yellowstone National Park. So we have a lot of geothermal energy. How can we access that and use that more readily for some of our energy solutions as well? There's also a focus on floating offshore wind, industrial heat, replacing those fossil resources, providing heat to produce chemicals and metals and things like that, and also achieving clean fuels and products. So all of these Earthshots are really framing an approach to how we will achieve net zero emissions economy-wide. So when we're thinking about our clean energy options, I think we need to consider a number of different questions. When we think about clean energy, many people go into that thinking that, oh, we need more wind, we need more solar. But that's not necessarily always going to be the right solution, depending on the type of energy that's required. Now, the energy that we use in most of our homes is electricity. We need electricity in our businesses. Electricity is a large portion of our demand, but it's really only about a third of the demand. Many of our energy users need heat or they need steam to drive those processes. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those split for industry here in a moment. So first question, what do you really need? Because if we are taking a heat source and converting it to electricity, as we do in nuclear energy, we lose a lot of energy in that process. We have about a 30 to 40% conversion efficiency to go from heat to electricity. But ultimately, if our demand is for heat, converting that electricity back to heat is a big loss. So we need to think about what we really need and then start considering the solutions that fit. We also need to think about how flexible that energy needs to be. Is the energy demand that's being met constant, or does it vary significantly over time? And what type of variation does it exhibit? And we'll talk about each of these a little bit further as well. We also need to think about, is that energy going to be available on demand? Is it highly dependent on weather, as we see with many renewables, or is it available whenever we need it, such as a thermal power plant, like a nuclear plant? Next question is, how much space do I need to support that selected energy source? How large is the footprint of that plant to meet my energy needs? We need to think about the resources necessary to build those plants. So what materials are needed to construct the generation asset, such as that nuclear plant or that wind farm? And how are those resources obtained? Are they readily available within the United States or within the world, or are they fairly limited quantities of those materials? And then once you're done with that plant, how are they disposed of? Is there a clear path for that? We also need to think about the lifetime of the plant. Will this plant operate for 10 years, or will it operate 40 years or 80 years or even longer? And then, of course, cost. We do have to consider cost when we're looking at our clean energy options. How much will it cost me to build it from the start? What are the operations and maintenance costs throughout the lifetime of that plant? And when will that asset be paid off and thus be providing income to that utility? So these types of questions frame how we approach solutions to our energy needs, particularly as we look to this clean energy transition. So when I think about that type of energy used, this chart is very helpful. The data in it is a little bit old. It's from 2004, but I really include it here just as an illustration. We hear a lot of discussion around electrification. When we think about a clean energy transition, there's a lot of discussion about electrifying transportation, electrifying industrial facilities. But as I mentioned, sometimes electrification causes a lot of energy losses and in fact then increases the demand that facility may have. If we look in this figure just a little bit more closely, we can see that the chemicals industry, for example, only about 25% of the energy demand is actually electrical power. The remainder is split between steam systems as well as direct heat, fired heaters. If we look to petroleum refining, it's even more dramatic. Less than 10% of the energy demand is actually in the form of electricity. So as we start looking across this, we realize that electrification may not be the best approach to find clean energy solutions. And in fact, we need a mixture of heat, steam, and electricity to best meet these demands. We also see a significant change in how our electrical demand profiles look each and every day. So this example is from a region in Texas called the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas. And it shows us how those fuel sources are used on a daily basis to meet electricity demand. So this demand profile is from 2007. And you can see that those thermal assets, that nuclear and coal, operate pretty much as baseload. They operate all the time, and we use the other resources such as natural gas to manage that flexible demand throughout the cycle of a day, because demands change as people go to work, come back home, make dinner, etc. But if we look at a more recent profile from 2020, we see a very different picture. Now, as we have more and more of the variable renewables coming online, such as wind and solar, we can see that there is a much greater need for flexibility in those other demand sources. And in fact, there are some cases where this blue line dips well below into this baseload as we have more and more renewables that we rely on to meet peak demand. We find that there are times at which there simply isn't enough at night when the wind may not be blowing and the sun is not out, where we need to operate flexibly with those baseload sources such as the nuclear plant. This changes how we look at the right energy mix to meet our energy demands overall. And this changes seasonally as well. So we see a significant need for flexibility in our clean energy solutions. We also then need to think about that availability that I mentioned. So we all know that our renewable resources are a function of weather. So while wind and solar can be fantastic resources when they are available and when they are abundant in a particular region, they do suffer from the fact that they are not always available. And we see capacity factors of maybe 25 to 35% for those resources. However, when we look to how those couple with other technologies, such as nuclear, we can see that the capacity factor, or the time that that energy source is available for use, is much, much higher. And nuclear energy boasts a capacity factor of 92.5% across all of our nuclear plants operating in the US. So that's pretty phenomenal. And it means that regardless of the weather, if I go to flip the switch in my home when I get home, that light's going to come on, that air conditioning is going to come on, because we have a source that is not dependent on the weather conditions. So these are factors that need to play together to ensure that we have the energy that we need when we need it. We also need to think about land use. So if you look over to the right side of this slide, what we're looking at here is relative land use of electricity generation options per unit of electricity, meaning we need a lot more land to produce the same amount of electricity from a biomass system as compared to, say, a nuclear system. These dots are the relative size of how much land you need. So again, I don't want to say that those are not reliable and valuable resources to utilize. We just need to consider the impact that they may have on the land and the location that it needs to be sited. And if we think about this in a very calculated approach, we can optimize how we use the land available and still meet those needs. Perhaps a mix of solar resources with nuclear resources in the Southwest, or wind resources with nuclear energy in the region that I live in, where we have some very, very windy days. And we can think about ways in which we can best optimize those resources that we have available to us to meet these energy demands. And we also need to think about how large each of those units is. Nuclear energy is developing more and more options around the size of systems. On the left side, you see the footprint, the large yellow circle corresponding to a plant that's operating today, a large 1,000 megawatt facility. If we look at some of the newer system designs, you can see that some of them, small modular reactors, might only take about 50 acres, and a microreactor may take less than an acre to produce a megawatt of electricity to support Arctic regions, industrial applications, etc. So we have more of a mix of options, and we can begin to understand how we can optimally use those. So how are we thinking outside the box to meet clean energy demands? So today's energy systems, we really see a lot of independent generation. So we see individual generators contributing to meet grid demand. So this nuclear plant on the top is producing electricity, it's going out to the grid, and it's being sent to customers. Similarly, these other plants are independently operating to meet that grid demand, but are not really tightly coordinated and coupled. They're more loosely coordinated across a large area. And if we look at those industrial demands, those are typically individual thermal sources like a coal-fired unit or a natural gas-fired unit, providing the heat and steam necessary to support a chemical plant, for example. And of course, transportation is mostly relying on fossil fuels with some electrification, and that is growing. But I hope you're beginning to see that based on those huge goals that have been established to really achieve these net zero solutions, we need all of the above. We need all of these options available, and we need to look at how we directly use heat to support these applications as well. So within the research that we have been doing at the national laboratories, we've been starting to look at how we transform that energy paradigm of using one generator to meet one demand, where we now start thinking about, well, what do I have available to me? Do I have a good wind resource? Do I have solar? Do I have hydro? I want to use those that when they are available, but I want to couple those with this reliable, dispatchable energy source, such as a nuclear plant. That may be a plant that's already on the grid and operating on that large 1,000-megawatt scale, or it may be a new plant that would be built to meet the demands in a particular region, such as a megawatt scale microreactor or a few hundred megawatts for a small modular reactor. By using these systems together, we can flexibly meet the demand for electricity on the grid, but then we can also directly use heat to support other applications in industry. You see in the middle here also a circle on energy storage. There may be need to store some of that energy to manage those huge fluctuations that we're starting to see in energy demands, recognizing that these sources on the right may not be available all the time, and we need to store some of that energy and buffer it to allow an easier manner of coupling with these nuclear resources. And then we can understand, well, what are the energy demands in that particular deployment location? So we know that we always need electricity, but perhaps it's in an area where we can take advantage of district heating networks and provide clean heat to heat our homes. Or perhaps it's in an area where we need to provide clean water, provide desalination, or support iron and steel manufacturing or fertilizers for agriculture. Or over here, we're looking at chemical processes and how do we provide clean heat and electricity to support those processes. So these are the types of solutions that we are really diving into to understand how we best utilize all of these resources. One example I like to give is if I'm going out to the moon or Mars and I'm going to create a localized society, I'm not going to throw away energy. I am going to use every watt of energy I have because it's going to cost me a lot to put it up there on the moon. But when we look at our systems here on Earth, that's exactly what we do. When we have wind available, we might be curtailing other resources such as that nuclear plant, or we may have to curtail renewables, meaning reducing that power that we send to the grid because we simply don't need it at certain times of the day. But by looking at this holistically across all of these energy demands, we can start to identify solutions where we use all of the energy that we have produced at all times. So just thinking about how we would do it if we weren't here at home on the Earth, I think gives us some new ways to think about how we approach our energy systems that we use here. So when we look at these possible solutions of combination, we look across the board. We look at many different opportunities to utilize those nuclear energy resources, to utilize direct production of electricity from renewables, or to use renewable heat from resources such as geothermal or concentrated solar. On the right, you can see many different processes and begin to understand, well, what are those requirements for energy? You can see orange and red lines corresponding to heat requirements into those processes. You can see green for electricity, and you can see the blue for hydrogen. We'll talk a little bit more about hydrogen and why that's become so important. And we can begin to understand where these solutions can be most impactful to reducing emissions. So on the right-hand side, you see numbers associated with millions of tons of CO2 emissions from the year 2019. So you can see some large numbers on petroleum refining and chemicals manufacturing. Transportation, of course, swamps many of these other emission sectors, as well as electricity. So we can begin to understand where we should begin looking at these clean energy solutions first to make the biggest steps forward with CO2 emissions reduction. So I mentioned hydrogen. Hydrogen's shown in the middle because it can be an end product, but it can also be an intermediate energy storage component or an energy carrier, where that hydrogen can be combusted directly alongside natural gas to produce electricity. It can also be run through what is called a fuel cell to produce electricity directly. We can also use it as a feedstock in many of these applications over on the right to produce liquid fuels for transportation that now can be much lower emitting relative to the fuels that we use today. It can be used in carbon conversion processes, so transitioning carbon resources such as coal to the products that we use, such as plastics and polymers and asphalt for our roads. Hydrogen is a key component in many metal manufacturing processes, as well as chemicals manufacturing. So you'll hear a lot of discussion about hydrogen because it connects to so many of these industries over on the right. And it becomes a way that we can make significant progress to clean energy introduction much more rapidly than if we independently look at each of these industries. So hydrogen, we look at where that's being used today. About 55% of it goes to ammonia production, where that ammonia goes into chemical manufacturing as well as fertilizers. So we can start looking at pathways to decarbonize our agricultural sectors. It also is used in petroleum refining processes and methanol production, as well as many other application areas, even foods. So hydrogen plays a role in each of our lives every day, even if we don't notice it. And the problem is that about 95% of the hydrogen produced in the United States today comes from natural gas. We use natural gas and we combust it to make the heat necessary to break down more natural gas. And when you do that, you get hydrogen very efficiently, but you also get carbon dioxide. So we need to look at ways in which we can reduce that emission associated with producing this hydrogen that goes into so many parts of our lives. So we are spending a lot of time within the laboratories in the United States, as well as around the world, to identify clean pathways to getting to hydrogen. Here at Idaho National Laboratory, we focus on a process called high temperature electrolysis, meaning we take steam and use electricity and heat to break that down into hydrogen and oxygen. So now we no longer have a pathway to emissions associated with that. Our colleagues at the Renewable Energy Laboratory focus their efforts on low temperature electrolysis, which breaks down water and uses some different pathways to get to that clean hydrogen, but we also have hydrogen and then the co-product of oxygen, so no emissions. So there's a really good incentive to begin to look at pathways to use clean generation, nuclear plants, wind, solar, geothermal, all of those things that can be used to support water and steam electrolysis to get to that hydrogen, which begins to impact then many aspects of our lives. And you can see this here with oil refining and synthetic fuels, grid storage. As I mentioned, hydrogen is simply holding onto that energy for later use, so we can use it for electricity. We can produce fertilizers and steel for many different components. So there's a lot of incentive to reduce the costs associated with producing that clean hydrogen. And that's at the center of that first Earthshot initiative that I mentioned, which is seeking to reduce emissions by, seeking to reduce the cost of clean hydrogen by 80% relative to where it is today. And this is a reality. We saw first production of hydrogen on site at a nuclear plant here in the United States in March of this year. And that will be followed by several other demonstrations. So this isn't just an idea. This isn't just something that we're working on our computers. This is actually being implemented at nuclear plants that are currently operating, and of course at many renewable facilities as well. So what are our nuclear energy opportunities as we begin to think about clean energy solutions? So right now we have 93 reactors operating in the United States today, and these are light water reactors, meaning they use water to cool the plant and to produce electricity. Each of these reactors provides electricity to support the grid. So these plants are primarily just supporting electricity production, and they're all large scale. So around 1,000 megawatts of electricity. Some are a bit smaller, but these plants have a really long lifetime. Their initial license is for 40 years, and many are being extended out to 80 years of operation. So these are resources that we can continue to utilize to support the grid, but we can also begin to look at how we can use those for these other applications, such as hydrogen production or directly providing heat to industrial users. And what about advanced nuclear energy? So there's a lot of work going on right now in developing the next generation of nuclear technologies. So as I mentioned, our plants today are all falling into this large scale bubble. But many of the developments are in these smaller scale systems, 20 to 300 megawatts or sub 20 megawatts with our microreactors over here. And many of them are looking to alternative coolants, different coolants than water that can operate at higher temperatures and offer different performance benefits overall. These systems that operate at higher temperature give us more flexibility in how we meet those industrial heat demands. And the variety of sizes that we have available in these technologies now begins to open up opportunity for nuclear energy to support smaller regions, to support focused industrial facilities. These are areas in which large reactors have not made sense because they're just too big for the grid that it's needed for, or too big for the industrial application. But as we have more of these smaller reactors, they can be available to support these systems and in fact be very complementary to similar renewable facilities in those regions, because now they're of comparable size and they can work together very efficiently and be directly coupled to meet that wide array of energy demands. So we begin to see support for versatile applications, that deployment flexibility. These advanced reactors also offer us much longer fuel cycles, so less frequently having to go in and refuel those plants. Large scale plants operating today have typical refueling cycles of about 18 months to 24 months, whereas many of these advanced reactors can operate 5 years, 10 years, or even longer on a single loading of fuel. We also have opportunity to reduce costs to make these systems because they are now smaller and can be made in a factory and then shipped pretty much fully assembled out to the site. We also have many inherent safety factors being built into these designs, meaning that in the event of any off-normal event, they don't require human interaction to shut down. They are based on the laws of physics, and they will naturally shut themselves down when things go outside of their standard operating modes. For example, extreme weather conditions or a hurricane or a loss of offsite power. So they would be naturally shut down just based on the physics within the system. And we see many, many projects around the world developing these advanced reactors. In fact, more than 70 at latest count of private sector projects around the world under development. And here in the US, I'm not going to go into this detail. We have many, many demonstration projects happening over the next decade. Where I'm at right now in the state of Idaho, and at Idaho National Laboratory, we will be supporting many of these plant demonstrations throughout the decade. And these cover many of these technology areas that I just mentioned on the past slide. So these are real. These aren't just ideas and designs in a computer. These are really coming forward and being built and being ready to be solutions for these clean energy goals that we have set out. Okay, so now in these last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about how do we engage the next generation. So I know we have a variety of people on this call. We have educators from kindergarten through 12th grade. We have, I'm sure, some college educators. We have a wide variety of technical folks. And how we address each of those groups and bringing these concepts forward. These are tough concepts. Nuclear energy is a tough concept. Energy in general is a difficult concept. So how do we engage that next generation? So I had the opportunity to be a part of an executive leadership program through the U.S. Women in Nuclear over this past year. And we put together a capstone project that we call See It to Imagine It. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about that, and this toolkit is available for downloading. And I would encourage you to reach out to the team should you have questions about that or ideas. But let me just tell you a little bit more about what's included there. So the See It to Imagine It project really produces a comprehensive toolkit that can be used by nuclear professionals, industry organizations, parents, teachers, coaches, and other influencers to attract young people to STEM. Now you see a focus here on young women because this is something out of the Women in Nuclear, and we find that young women really are the ones that need some more encouragement to stay in these STEM areas. So we've developed a simplified nuclear fact sheet, inspirational videos by people that are actually working in the field, really going into that theme of see it to imagine it. If I focus on energy and if I focus on nuclear energy, where might I end up? What might I do with my career? And is that going to be fun or is that going to be just boring? So these videos help these students to better understand that potential career path. It brings in a number of experiments and activities that are easy to grasp by these individuals, the parents or those organizations sharing the information. And we've also put together a choose your own adventure presentation essentially, where a student can go in and begin looking at, well, if I go and decide to go to college and I'm going to major in chemistry, where might that take me in the nuclear career pathway? Or if I go back and I say, you know what, I want to do research. Do I need to go to graduate school? If I go to graduate school, where might I end up in my career in this nuclear industry? So these are really good tools. We hope to continue adding more and more videos and more to that choose your own adventure. And we do look for others out there to help contribute to those so that we can really broaden that. And we could even broaden this from the nuclear energy area to energy and clean energy in general by amplifying some of these tools. So let's talk a little bit about this toolkit and where it's targeted. I do believe that it could be scaled up to older groups and it can be scaled down to younger groups, but the target audience is really in that sweet spot of 8th graders, 13-year-olds that are really beginning to question where they're going in their lives. They're beginning to question if they're really cut out for a career in science and technology and math. And that's the point at which we really begin to see gender stereotypes taking a role. We can see in the data here a much lower percentage of girls entering STEM fields than we do boys. And this is that middle school age group. And we're starting to ask these students to make decisions about their career paths much earlier at this 8th grade point where they're deciding what math classes to go into in high school, what high school to go to. Are they going into a health careers high school or a technology high school or one focused on computer science? So we need to give them the tools to understand what those decisions can mean when they really don't have that information available to them. These students care about the environment. They hear more and more about climate change. They are motivated to find solutions. And so we really want to capture them and give them that purpose in their studies and give them that purpose as they enter their careers. So this fact sheet is fun, it's colorful, it's short and to the point. We recognize, I know we've got some teachers out there, we've got parents out there listening in. We know that kids today don't learn, talk, or pay attention the same way we did when we were kids or the way we do as adults. So this is why we have developed a fact sheet that's really interactive. It's not just listing the information, but listing it and giving links and access to social media to go find out more, to conduct virtual tours to understand what these nuclear energy facilities really look like, to explore where they might go in their careers, and to really better engage where they're at. They're in a fast-moving society. They don't want to sit and watch something for multiple hours. They want the information quickly. They want it at the tips of their fingers. So these inspirational videos are from people actually working in the field, in the nuclear industry, in national laboratories like myself. And we really are trying to break those stereotypes with regard to who really fits in this box in working in a nuclear energy career. So hopefully this will inspire some of those young girls and young boys as well to enter this industry and to enter the energy field in general. And we've also brought in a lot of social media videos as well. We see more and more influencers. We know that kids are on platforms such as TikTok and similar platforms. They're looking at things that are quick snippets of information. Some of you may have seen the nuclear influencer that we've highlighted here, Isabel Boemeke, who does some really fantastic videos that are short and to the point and provide some information that is approachable for these young kids. We also can see role models like Grace Stanke, who is Miss America. She's a nuclear engineer. It's cool to study this energy stuff, and it's cool to do what's hard to really accomplish some of these grand challenges of our time. And we try to make it easy for the teachers, easy for those industry professionals that are going out and engaging with these kids by putting together a list of experiments and activities, and even providing a shopping list for what you need to go out to order from Amazon before you go out and do this. And we tried to keep it very inexpensive to put together this experimental kit. And this is where I think there might be some flexibility. We've targeted middle schoolers, but it can, again, be shifted down to the lower grades and shifted up to the higher grades as well, and still be very engaging. So here is that list that we've put together as the types of things you might want to put in that kit to go out to schools or to teach in your own classroom, really simplifying the process to bring this complex information to the students in a way that is tangible and understandable. And I mentioned before the choose your own adventure presentation path. It's a PowerPoint that you click through and you can choose what type of path sounds interesting. Is it being a technician? Is it being an undergraduate chemist? Is it being a PhD nuclear engineer? And where might I end up in my career? So this is a fun tool to help students walk through some of those decisions. So I encourage you to take a look at those. We are continuing to add to that. We just presented this capstone project a couple of weeks ago, and we have more that we will be adding to that. Each of these QR codes is something that you should be able to scan, get to those basic tools, and then dive deeper. So all in all, we are trying to achieve net zero communities, net zero societies that really leverage and take advantage of all those resources that we have. It's not a choice between nuclear energy and renewable energy. It's how do I best utilize all these resources in a region to meet my needs for electricity, for building heating, to provide energy to produce steel, to provide my transportation systems, to support the agriculture in the region. So this is our vision. And we're trying to pull those tools together to make it a reality. So I will stop there and hope to have some questions. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see again, and can always pop back to it if needed.
Thank you, Shannon. Wonderful work that you're doing there at Idaho National Laboratory. I'm very excited to hear what you've done. It's been a few years and tremendous progress that you and your team have done. We have several questions in the chat. So let me give you the first one that came in. So it's a little bit bigger system that you're talking about. Is the energy input into a nuclear power plant comes from uranium. Can you tell us about harvesting uranium from seawater passively?
So I'll stay pretty high level because I've not
Sure.
worked in that area, but certainly there are small amounts of uranium in seawater, and there is a DOE research program that looks at how we can do that efficiently. So that it is a resource that we know it's there. We've been able to extract that from the seawater. We need to get to processes that are highly efficient so that it's cost effective. That always comes down to it. Even if we have a resource, we need to be able to get to it at a reasonable cost. So I believe that research program is still ongoing. I've not looked at their progress recently, but I would encourage you to take a look at the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy Programs list and see what they've done recently in that area.
Okay, thank you. So you talk about your different models that you could do simulation. So this question could, possibly test your simulation of looking at the system, and I'll just read it verbatim. I have heard others claim that if everybody had an electric vehicle, that if they charge them at home, virtually every arm of the grid would fail, as they're not able to deliver that much energy in most locations. Is this correct? Can you qualify with some claims to whether the extent needed to be?
So if we instantly snapped our fingers and everybody had an electric vehicle and everybody went home from work and plugged them in at the same time, it's a problem. The infrastructure cannot support that. One example that we like to give is if you are building a truck station, a truck stop of the future, and you've got fast chargers and you've got these semis that are there and they're all electrical and they want to gas up or re-electrify, charge very rapidly. And maybe you've got a few of those charging at one time. It's like plugging in a small hospital to the grid and then unplugging it again. So those are huge challenges that we do need to address. We need to build up the infrastructure, the transmission networks, the generation to support that massive amount of electricity demand that would come with everyone electrifying their transportation systems. We also need to make sure that those charging stations are reliable. So if they're all at home, that's one thing. We can plug in our vehicles and we can sign up for demand response, meaning that we put it in that, okay, my vehicle needs to be charged and ready to go by 7 a.m. And the grid may decide when it sends electricity to that charging station and when maybe it pulls some of that electricity from the vehicle to balance out the grid in that region. So there's some vehicle to grid work to help balance some of those challenges. But then we also have to consider, well, what are the implications of that, in that maybe my child is sick and at 2 a.m. I need to go to the hospital. We need to think about those social implications of having that kind of a demand-based charge and what the grid needs and what it can provide. We also need to look at that charger reliability, and that's actually some work that we do here at Idaho National Laboratory as a joint effort between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy, looking at reliability of our infrastructure. The number I saw recently was not very encouraging. It was about 7 out of 10 times that you go to charge your vehicle at some of these charging stations, it works. Well, what happens that other 30% of the time? Are you stuck? I live in Idaho. There's a lot of nothingness between our cities, so it doesn't give me a lot of confidence. So we're looking at where those failings are. Is it the card reader, so it can't even take my credit card? Is it a failure in the charger? Or is it a failure in the interconnection between the charger and my vehicle? Or is there a cyber-related issue where there's some malware, the computer code in there has gotten in there and is causing problems? So we're really increasing effort to improve that charging experience, to make sure that those chargers work, and to make sure that the grid does not collapse because of that. But that's one reason why I brought up the issue of electrification not always being the right answer. We need to electrify where it makes sense. So electrifying passenger vehicles, it makes sense. These are light duty vehicles. We can build up the infrastructure to support. Electrifying heavy duty transport vehicles such as semis or maritime vessels or aircraft, that may not make sense. Those may be better candidates for hydrogen fuel cells that produce electricity from that hydrogen directly and use that to propel the vehicle, or synthetic fuels where we take that hydrogen and we take captured carbon dioxide and combine that to make a liquid fuel that can provide a cleaner pathway and begin closing the carbon cycle to support those applications like aviation. So we need to look at this mix. But you're absolutely correct. If we did it today, we've got issues. We have a lot of work to do to support that.
Thank you, Shannon. Back when I was in graduate school, University of Wisconsin, there was a professor there that was looking at harvesting helium-3 from the surface of the moon. One of our participants asked, is there any efforts or anything you're aware of harvesting hydrogen from the sun and bringing it back to Earth?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that would be very challenging. I haven't even heard of that idea. So
Okay.
the one that I have heard of is looking at geologic hydrogen. Hydrogen in the ground, captured in our rocks and geologies. So there is actually some investment looking at that through our Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy under the Department of Energy. I've just seen that beginning discussion over the last 6 months or so. So there may be some novel solutions to get to some of that hydrogen, but again, it comes to efficiency of the processes, cost of the processes, and the best pathway to get there.
Okay, so the next question, they paid attention to the last part of your bio that you're part of GIF Generation International Forum and that new subcommittee. So I'm also a member in a different role. So can you tell our listeners of what that recently established interim task force is doing?
So sure. So Gen 4 International Forum, some of our listeners may not be as familiar with that. It brings together a number of different countries, and I don't remember the number off the top of my head, a lot of countries around the world that are working on advanced nuclear energy technologies, developing different types of reactors and implementing them for different applications, and sharing knowledge to really accelerate our development of those technologies. So this task force, which is now a full task force, not just interim, on non-electric applications of nuclear heat, really focuses some of those efforts looking across all of those reactor technologies to try to understand how we best utilize nuclear heat for hydrogen production or for chemical manufacturing or industrial heat applications. Building across lessons learned across all of our participant countries. If we look historically, this isn't actually a new idea. We've used nuclear energy, nuclear produced electricity and heat for pulp and paper manufacturing in the past. We've used it for district heating, and we've used it for water purification. We're doing that today in many countries. That's probably the best example. Water desalination around the world. So we try to build upon those lessons learned. If something is currently operating, how could we do that better? If it's something that's no longer operating, why is that the case? Why is that not operating? Is it something that we can learn and implement differently going forward? And really pulling together our knowledge on opportunity space. What studies are underway? What tools are available to do these analyses of complex energy systems? And how can those be leveraged across that whole team? So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to look at development around the world, because when we think about our energy challenges, this isn't just a US challenge or a Canada challenge or a France challenge. This is a global challenge. And we need to work together to get to that end goal of net zero in a way that makes sense. Because if we're all doing it independently, we don't have enough time or dollars to do that within the time frame that's been laid out.
Okay, thanks. Tell us about electrical storage. Long ago when I was at Wisconsin, they were talking about superconductors. So what are you guys doing out there in Idaho as far as electrical storage?
So there's a lot of work going on in electrical storage. Everybody knows a lot about lithium ion batteries. We hear about that quite a bit. We have those in our electric vehicles. There's new battery chemistries that are being developed as well. This isn't my main area of work, and so I don't want to get too deep into this, but we do a lot of work looking at new battery chemistries and how efficient can those be? Do those offer better environmental solutions when we look at resource availability and the back-end disposition of those batteries at the end of life? We've heard a lot about things like fires in lithium battery facilities, storage facilities. Are there other chemistries that can mitigate that? We work with a number of vehicle manufacturers to be an independent test facility for those technologies. So rather than a company testing and putting out data, we can independently test those different types of batteries, from the car battery size out to grid scale battery size. Here at the laboratory, we have 4 different testing laboratories that look at long duration performance, cyclic performance of different types of batteries, different battery vendors that may use the same chemistries as well as different chemistries. We look at extreme cold, extreme heat. We look at what happens to those if they've been exposed to water. Does that increase the chance of fires? Does it increase the chance of degradation? And we also work across many different companies to develop standards. So I mentioned the challenge of an EV not always charging because of the hardware not matching. How do you develop the industry standards such that we can eliminate that as a challenge? Battery storage has a lot of potential. It works very well for short duration storage. But when we start looking at long duration storage, that's where we start talking about new technology areas. We talk about thermal energy storage. We can talk about compressed air energy storage, hydrogen storage, different ways to get to storage that is longer than 10 hours is how DOE has defined it. But we really need to get to the point of storing energy on a seasonal basis to understand how we get through these different weather cycles to ensure that we have energy when it's needed, where it's needed.
Thanks. So tell us, with your models and the president's goal of net zero in the United States, how much more nuclear power do we need and renewables? And is it measured in gigawatts or terawatts? Can you give us a sense of scale?
So there's a series of liftoff reports that the Department of Energy has put out. One of those is on advanced nuclear energy. Right now, we have roughly 100 gigawatts of nuclear energy. To meet these goals, the estimates are that we need 200 more gigawatts of nuclear energy. So we need to triple our nuclear energy capacity. I don't recall the number right now on renewables, but it is substantial. Because it really does depend on how we approach all of these other aspects of it. If we electrify everything, that number is even higher than it would be if we look at thermal pathways as well. But on nuclear, we need to triple it.
Okay, so we'll ask you two easy questions that are coming up, and I'll save the easiest one for last. The next question is, what is your team or the department doing of using artificial intelligence to help that grid with these diurnal and yearly cycles of power? Is there any work going on there?
Yes, and I can't speak to it at depth, but we have a lot of work going on in smart grid technologies, using some of that AI predicting what the energy demand is going to be at different periods of time, using predictive tools in order to plan for how we are going to distribute the energy to meet demands across the grid. We also are building up strong cyber resilience to those infrastructures to ensure that we don't have bad actors coming in that try to shut down key assets that can shut down our grid. So we are trying to leverage those tools to make sure that we have a grid that is reliable, resilient, and available at all times. I'd be happy to dig deeper and identify the right people to talk to about that, but we are certainly using those technologies. We're also using a lot of our advances in computation, in the computational space, to predict better lifetime implications on these different types of systems, to reduce the amount of experiments that are needed to develop new technologies and really hone in on solutions more rapidly. So it is a key aspect of the work that we do every day.
Thanks. All right, the last one, and I'll read it verbatim. How can we help a young girl to start nuclear engineering in Africa?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm going to broaden that out to say,
Sure.
How do we help those students in developing countries know about these technologies and become aware of those technologies? I'm really proud to say that the Department of Energy is doing a lot to work with those countries, as is the Department of State and the International Atomic Energy Agency, developing tools and resources to go out and provide training to these students in these countries that don't have these technologies available to them today. In fact, I'm part of a project through the Clean Energy Ministerial, specifically under an initiative called Nuclear Innovation, Clean Energy Future, or NICE Future. We are just wrapping up a project with Kenya, where we are looking at how we can bring small nuclear energy systems into the country to support some of these regional villages that just don't have transmission. They don't have electricity available to them today. How do we do this in a way that ensures that we also build up a workforce within that country, So starting again at those young ages, those middle schools and high schools, bringing that into their curriculum and training up their staff to be able to operate these facilities, not just saying, oh, we'll bring it in and we'll operate it for you, but training their people to do that. There are programs through the Department of State, one that's called the FIRST program, and I can never get the acronym right, so I'll just say that it is establishing the foundational information and training associated with bringing in small modular reactors to these countries. IAEA has a milestones program that allows countries to look at where they are now and to step through the process to develop the tools and infrastructure necessary to support nuclear energy. And the group that I'm working with in the Office of Nuclear Energy is also developing some training programs to go into these communities to talk about these technologies that are really challenging. And here's where we're also trying to utilize some of those artificial intelligence and digital engineering tools to make it real and tangible and exciting to these students.
Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour. Shannon, thank you so much for giving tonight's webinar. I appreciate all the information. And for the people that showed up, thank you for attending, and we'll get the information out to you tomorrow, and you have this. So thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye.